because what had been going on all my life since I was a small child was I felt in my heart there has to be a real meaning and purpose to life, and someday when I'm older, I'll come to know the real meaning and purpose to life, which I thought would come from entering into a personal relationship with God, which I honestly thought would happen at my bar mitzvah. The bar mitzvah is like the Jewish version of confirmation. When the child is about 13, he goes through this ceremony in the synagogue and enters religious adulthood. And I honestly thought that at my bar mitzvah, the veil would drop and I would come into a personal relationship with God. And when that didn't happen, it was actually one of the saddest days of my childhood. But then pretty soon I decided the real meaning and purpose of life would come when I got a driver's license. Or when I left home, or when I started university, or if I got into Harvard Business School, and so forth. So I had for about 10 or 15 years these external objects that I thought would give my life real meaning. But here at the point I'm describing, when I was 29, I was already far more successful in a worldly sense than I ever expected to be, being a professor at Harvard Business School, but life still had no meaning or purpose. You know, we were just a chemical accident, some lightning hit some mud filled with amino acids, 5 billion years ago, and here we are. There's no meaning or purpose to life. We live for 70 or 80 or 90 years and die, and that's it. There's no pattern to things that happen, and so forth. So there was no point to anything despite the worldly success. But the difference being, at this point, there was nothing more I could look forward to that I could imagine would give life meaning, because there was no brass ring out there to still reach for. So I fell into the deepest despair of my life at that point, a kind of existential despair. And it was in that I was walking in nature early one morning, just lost in my thoughts. That's the only solace I found, would be to go to some beautiful place, in the middle of nature. So I was just walking along, and I had long since, I was essentially an atheist at that point. I had long since given up on any idea of God or religion. And I received the most spectacular grace in my life. As I was walking along from one moment to the next, the curtain between earth and heaven disappeared, and I found myself in the presence of God, very knowingly in the presence of God, in a very intimate conversation with God, so to speak, seeing my life and experiencing my life as I would see it after I died and looked back over it in the presence of God. And I saw instantaneously, I saw how I would feel about everything after I died. I saw that my two greatest regrets when I died would be, number one, all of the time and energy I had wasted worrying about not being loved, when every moment of my existence I was held in an ocean of love, greater than I ever imagined could exist, coming from this all-knowing, all-loving God. And the other regret would be every hour I had wasted doing nothing of value in the eyes of heaven. I saw my life as though, all my life I had been greedily accumulating piles of Monopoly money, that brightly colored paper money from the game of Monopoly, when right next to it there was a stack of gold coins that I had been ignoring, which would be, of course, merit in heaven. I saw how foolish it was to be greedy for things that wouldn't be doing me any good at all, even 100 years hence, when I'm dead, whereas I could have been greedy, so to speak, to accumulate treasure in heaven, from which I would very literally be benefiting 100 million years from now. Now, I know this isn't the healthiest attitude in the world, but I was a Harvard Business School marketing professor, so I have an excuse. Everything was net present value, everything was maximizing returns, and I was still seeing this a little bit in that way. So I didn't see the error in being greedy, I just saw how stupidly greedy I had been. And if I want to be smart and greedy, the only thing that made sense would be to try to be as great a saint as possible, essentially. Another thing that I saw in this experience was how foolish I had been. I had basically spent my life sort of looking in the rearview mirror, saying to myself, if only that hadn't happened to me, then I would be happy today, or if only that hadn't happened to me, then I would be happy today. And nothing could be further from the truth, because everything that had ever happened to me had been the most perfectly designed thing that could come to meet me, coming from the hands of this all-knowing, all-loving God. Not only including those things that had caused the most suffering at the time, but especially those things that had caused the most suffering at the time. And of course, I saw that the meaning and purpose of my life was to worship and serve my Lord and God and Master who was revealing himself to me. Now, I will say one other thing. Probably the biggest single transformative aspect of this experience was just coming into the incredibly intimate knowledge that God not only knew me personally, not only knew my name, but had been watching over me and caring about me every moment of my existence from my conception, as though I were the only person he had ever created or ever would create. He not only knew and controlled everything that ever happened to me, but he knew how I felt at every moment of my life and cared about how I felt at every moment of my life. And in a fairly real way, was made happy by everything that made me happy, and was saddened with me by everything that made me sad. And it was coming into this understanding of how intimately God knew me and how intimately he loved me and cared about me every moment. That was by far the biggest transformative aspect of this. Now, one might ask, didn't you know that as a Jew? Now, in all honesty, if you read the Old Testament, that is not the picture of God you get. You get a little of it in the prophets, but you don't get any of it in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The picture you get of God is like the picture you see in Exodus, when God calls Moses up to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. He tells him, build a fence around the base of the mountain before you come up, because if anyone should even touch the base of the mountain while I'm on top, they will have to be instantly killed because of the sacrilege. So that's kind of the picture I had of God. Obviously this was not fitting in with that picture. So I prayed. I could not think of this God as the God of Judaism, as the God of the Old Testament. So as I was having this experience, I was actually still walking. It's a very curious, needless to say, state that I was in, because I still saw the physical world around me, the trees and the bushes and the insects, but I saw through it into the spiritual world. And the spiritual world was so much realer and so much more immediate and so much more concrete and substantial than the physical world that I wasn't surprised during this experience that I was seeing the spiritual world. The only thing I couldn't understand is how I could have ever not seen it, because it was so much more real than the physical world, which was like, a painted veil, a kind of gossamer veil that was simply shielding one's vision from the real world. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but sometimes when you go to the theater or go to the ballet, you'll be in the audience and you'll be looking at the stage, and there'll be a curtain on the stage and the lights will be on, and you'll just see the front of the curtain. And then they will turn off the house lights and there'll be lights shining on the front of the curtain, and you'll still just see the curtain. But then they will dim those lights and turn on the stage lights, and all of a sudden you see through the curtain to the actors on the stage or the dancers on the stage, and you barely see the curtain anymore. And it was like that. It was like the physical world just became that, very thin veil behind which I saw the spiritual world. So I was walking along still, and I prayed to this God who was so incredibly present. Let me know your name so I know what religion to follow to worship and serve you properly. I don't mind if you're Buddha and I have to become a Buddhist. I don't mind if you're Krishna and I have to become Hindu. I don't mind if you're Apollo and I have to become a Roman pagan, as long as you're not Christ and I have to become Christian. And I very literally prayed that. And God respected that prayer, Christ respected that prayer, and he didn't tell me who he was. And I wasn't ready to hear it, obviously. But I went back home. Let me make a little bit of a digression that's a little bit related to the speakers yesterday morning, which is the picture that I have of the state that Jews are in with their resistance to Christ and their resistance to Christianity. Is sort of like the following, parable or metaphor or something. Imagine a little boy with a pet dog, and that dog just loves this little boy. The little boy is, the moon and the stars and the sun to this dog. The dog just like curls up under his chair all day waiting for him, to come to the table or whatever. And the dog lives for this little boy. And then the little boy goes off to school, and the dog is, incredibly mournful and inconsolable. And the little boy grows up, and he becomes like a teenager, and he comes back home. And he knocks on the door to come into the house, and the little dog is going nuts, barking at him and wants to tear him to pieces, because he thinks that little boy, that young man, is invading and taking the place of the little boy who he wants to stay loyal to. Does that make sense? And that's kind of the state that I feel like I was in as a Jew, because in a way the state that Jews are in is they're trying to stay loyal to Christ, actually, to Christ as he revealed himself in the Old Testament and in the days of, before he incarnated. And out of their loyalty to Christ, they're refusing to accept Christ. It makes sense, right? But anyway, that was all a digression. Back to the beach. So I came out of this experience slowly over a period of hours, a little bit, in another sense, over a period of days. I went back home to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time, as a Harvard professor. I couldn't care at all about teaching Harvard MBAs how to make a little more money anymore. All I wanted to do was pursue this experience and learn who this God was and how to worship and serve him properly. So I did some stupid things during that year, because this had been a mystical experience, and so I looked into some various forms of mysticism, which were a very bad idea. But I did one smart thing, which is every night before going to sleep, I would say a short prayer that I had made up to learn the name of my Lord and Master and God who had revealed himself to me. I'd say this prayer just before going to sleep. And a year to the day after that initial experience, and I know it was a year to the day because I prayed in thanksgiving that day before going to sleep. A year to the day after that first experience, I went to sleep, and I thought I was awoken by a hand gently on my shoulder and led to a room and left alone with the most beautiful young woman I could ever imagine. And I knew without being told that it was the Blessed Virgin Mary. When I found myself in her presence, all I wanted to do was throw myself on my knees and somehow honor her appropriately. In fact, the first thought that crossed my mind was, oh my gosh, I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary, but I didn't. Now, I'll say a couple of things about that initial part of that experience. First of all, I now understand my body was asleep in bed. I thought I was awake at the time. My memory represents it as though I were awake, but I understand that if there had been a camera in the room, it would have shown me asleep in bed. But anyway, when I found myself in her presence, I was just overwhelmed, and actually lifted into a state of ecstasy simply by the love that flowed from her. And as beautiful as she was to look at, even more powerfully affecting was the sound of her voice. When she spoke, her voice was like what makes music music. It was like the essence of music. And it carried with it a love that just flowed through all of my fibers and lifted me up into a state of ecstasy. And the first thing she said to me was she offered to answer any questions I might have for her. As I mentioned, my first thought when I was in her presence was I wish I at least knew the Hail Mary so I could honor her appropriately. So when she offered to answer any questions I might have for her, I kind of wanted to ask her to teach me the Hail Mary, but I was too proud to admit that I didn't know it. So as a kind of indirect way, I said, what's your favorite prayer to you? Figuring she'd teach me the Hail Mary, right? Her first response was a little bit coy. It was, I love all prayers to me. But I was a little bit pushy. Maybe that's because I'm a New York Jew and maybe not. But I said, but you must love some prayers to you more than others. And she relented and she recited a prayer, but it was in Portuguese and I didn't know any Portuguese. So all I could do was make the effort to remember the first few syllables phonetically. And the next morning when I woke up, I wrote them down phonetically. And then later when I met a Portuguese Catholic woman, I asked her to recite all of the Marian prayers in Portuguese so I could try to identify it. And to the best of my ability, I identified it as, O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. I'll mention maybe 3 or 4 of the other questions and answers. Most of the questions were simply expressions of I don't know how to put it, of my response to her presence, which was, I'll go into the question. It's hard to describe, but I was absolutely overwhelmed. I knew that she was a human being, a person during this experience, but she was so glorious and so magnificent and so exalted that it was really hard to hold on to that thought that she was a human being. And in my defense, I will say that we know from, I believe it's the letter of John, when an angel appeared to him, he threw himself on the ground and began to worship the angel until the angel said, "Get up, don't do that, that's not appropriate.